Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. There are more than 9,000 gang members in New Zealand and thousands more associates. The coalition government from the get-go promised a crackdown on gangs. They've banned gang insignia in public, handed police greater powers, and created laws to disrupt get-togethers. But is that all enough? Jared Savage has been a journalist at the New Zealand Herald for about 20 years with a focus on organised crime. His latest book, Underworld, is the third in a series he's released since 2020, and the latest instalment delves deeper into our country's dark underbelly of gangs, guns, drugs and money. Lots and lots of money. Today on The Front Page, Savage joins us to discuss the rising threat of organised crime in New Zealand. So Jared, it's not a giveaway, I reckon, when I say your latest read starts by saying the situation is now even more dangerous and the stakes are higher and that it's life and death out there. Can you tell me how things have escalated?
Well, I think it comes down to, first and foremost, the huge amounts of drugs which are coming into our country. When I first started reporting to the Herald on this sort of 15 odd years ago, 1 kilo of meth was a big deal, and it was a front page story, and literally a front page story. And these days, even the smallest of drug dealers would have far more than a kilo in the back of the car. We're talking imports of 400, 500, 600, 700 kilograms. Not only are we seeing those big busts happening regularly or almost routinely, it seems to have had quite those big busts having quite a negligible impact on how much drugs are actually being consumed. And we can see that through the wastewater testing. For a long time, the wastewater testing showed we were consuming around about 15 kilos of methamphetamine per week. Then last year, about this time last year, it was more than double, from about 15 to 40 kilos every single week, and it dropped down a little bit by the end of the year. But I guess it shows that we've now reached a tipping point where we're on the map now globally for organised crime. Huge amounts of drugs are being sent here regularly, and it's a real uphill battle for the police and customs and other law enforcement agencies to really investigate and stop these syndicates.
I guess when it comes to gangs and the underworld, the public's general fear of gangs and stuff like that arguably led to or contributed to a changing government, right? You've got National's hard line on law and order policies. You've got the crackdown on gang crime, things like that. Is the public right to be afraid?
I don't think people listening to this should be afraid of going home or walking, going about their daily lives in terms of the violence and the conflict that we were seeing quite regularly there a couple of years ago. Normally sort of gang and organised crime sort of conflict is between gangs. It's not between, if you're an innocent member of the public, just go make your business, not part of that world. I don't really think you're in huge immediate danger. But what does happen in those sort of situations, which can be quite chaotic, quite fluid, is that people get caught in the crossfire. And there have been instances of that in recent years. I mean, there's an unsolved homicide at the moment, from out East Auckland way, where a grandfather was gunned down on his doorstep in a execution style drive-by targeted shooting. Well, he wasn't the intended target of that. Somebody else was, another member of his family was, and who was involved in that world. So those are the unintended consequences that can happen. But generally speaking, we're not in danger of being hurt or shot or killed or embroiled into the violence, but that it does have an unsettling impact on society. And obviously the more drugs that are out there, that contributes to other wider social issues, which in turn indirectly do affect all of us.
Now, I know that people love to blame the Aussie 501s for the escalation in gang problems, right? But New Zealand has always had a pretty gnarly gangland. I mean, you've got the Comancheros, the Mongols and Banditos coming in, sure, but then you've got the Mongrel Mob and Black Power and all those homegrown ones as well. But how has the introduction of Aussie gangs changed the game?
New Zealand has always had an entrenched sort of gang lifestyle going back to the 1950s. Mongrel Mob and Black Power, for example, were born out of sort of, abuse of state care and sort of wider socio-economic sort of problems that were happening, and basically bands of young men coming together to sort of in a rebellious way. And there was a lot of sort of wanton or disorganized crime that came out of it. Back in sort of the late 1990s and early 2000s, methamphetamine was introduced to the country, and we saw for the first time a real organised crime element coming out of the gangs that were already here. Members of the Headhunters, for example, or the Hells Angels motorcycle gangs were heavily involved in the meth trade. And then we've seen over the past 20 years since that time an evolution where, those gangs were working with international partners to bring drugs into the country. What has really changed in the past 10 years in particular, unfortunately, is, members of Australian motorcycle gangs being deported here and establishing chapters, you can call them branch offices really, of genuinely, truly international organised crime groups. And I think that's the difference. They had genuine connections to supply lines overseas, not just in Asia, but sort of the South Americas, Mexico, the US. And that's really led to this influx, what I talked about before, the 1 kilo drug bust turning into 500 kilo drug bust. That it's no coincidence that happened around about the same time that we started seeing the deportees come here. They've also brought a more sort of brazen approach, a more sort of arrogant approach to the underworld, and what that's led to, more shootings and violence, but also kind of a escalation or a tit for tat. So the groups that were already here have upped their game in response to how the Australian interlopers have sort of conducted their business. So we're seeing things ratchet up. It's not just the Aussie gangs now that are doing these big imports, but they were certainly the ones that sort of kicked things off.
As I've said before, gangs are not nice people. Those opposing our gang policies often paint them as very fine community organisations. Well, I say to you, they are not Rotary. They inflict serious harm on our communities through peddling illegal drugs, and are responsible, frankly, for a vast proportion of our serious violence that happens on our streets. As I say, it is 1% of New Zealand's population, creating 1/5 of all of our serious violent crime and homicides, and 1/4 of all our firearm offences.
And while we're on the subject of international syndicates, I guess when we talk about the underworld here and gangs and stuff, we think of the patches, we think of the bikes, we think of the Lambos and the leather and all that kind of stuff. But what I found interesting from all of your reporting, Jared, is shining a light on, say, the Asian syndicates that are working in New Zealand and the history here. You mentioned that meth really grew in popularity and really had a foothold in New Zealand society in the early 2000s. But how have the Asian syndicates been involved?
Yeah, and so Asian organised crime has had a foothold here again for a long time, but they became increasingly important back in sort of the early 2000s, working in with the motorcycle gangs, I suppose, because a lot of the Asian organised crime groups had access to either the ingredients for methamphetamine or the finished product themselves, either back in China or Southeast Asia, where so back 2000 in the 2000s they were the ones that were able to supply and source that material and bring it into the gangs here, who then distribute it amongst the community. So it was like a business relationship there, and that's carried on to this day. Methamphetamine production is still largely sourced out of Southeast Asia, although Mexico and other areas as well. So those sort of Asian organised crime groups are still a huge player in the scene here. It's like, yes, gang motorcycle gangs in particular are often the sort of the visual face of organised crime here because, they're so, identifiable in many regards, whereas the Asian kind of groups have kind of gone under the radar a little bit. But there's also, a lot of strong evidence now to show that Mexican cartels are sending large amounts of drugs here as another rival supplier to the Asian groups, as well as sort of cocaine coming out of Central and South America as well. So it's all part of a wider ecosystem. They're all working together to make lots of money. Largely, those big groups overseas are interested in a small market like New Zealand, because we are a small market, but we're a very lucrative market because of the margins that can be made even off the smaller amounts of drugs. So it's certainly a global business. You've got gangs here working with global business partners, and in the same way, the police and customs now work with their international partners. Transnational organised crime, by its definition, crosses borders quite fluidly. And in response, sort of the police and customs and others are sort of having to work with their partners overseas as well, because there's no point just focusing on what's happening here. And we're seeing a lot more cooperation as well, which is leading to some of these big drug busts.
In terms of the tools that police and customs have, obviously, I've seen a couple of quotes that they're just working against the tide, aren't they? So you get a 600-kilogram bust of meth over here, but over here, like, what's coming through? I mean, it must just be a never-ending job for them.
That's right. I mean, it's just, and talking to people who are working in those investigations, they go from job to job to job. And as soon as you might spend months or even years in some cases investigating a particular group, but there are multiple other groups working at the same time doing the same thing. And, these investigations are very time consuming. They're very resource intensive. And not even up to the point where the bust is made or the arrests are made. Like, there's a lot of work that happens from the first arrest all the way through to the trial. And so that means that those resources are not investigating other groups, and there are many of them. I mean, literally, this is my third book on the topic. I think if I chose to, I could continue writing one every year just about, because there's so much material, and that just shows, again, sort of the demand for drugs, which is driving that sort of entrenched organised crime problem in our country.
When it comes to gang life, and what is associated with it. So you've got the outlaws, the guns, the drugs, the violence, the money, right? On the flip side, you do hear, and I don't know whether I've been sucked into the PR or not, but you do hear about the camaraderie among gang members, the idea of family. Do you think gangs are inherently evil?
Oh, I think evil is a strong word. I think a lot of activities which come out of gang life are terrible, but I can see the attraction to it as well. I mean, gangs, many incidences are born out of, tough situations, tough homes, tough communities, where people might not have a loving family, or they might not have a job, or they might not have that sense of purpose or camaraderie or brotherhood that gang life can project and they can attract. And so like a lot of gang members joined out of trauma in their own life. The genesis of gangs in New Zealand comes from abuse and state care. So, I can see there are a lot of attractive things to being in a gang, and that is that brotherhood, identity, camaraderie, sense of purpose. But on the flip side, amongst those groups, there's a lot of serious criminal activity, and we can't get away from that. And whether or not individual members are involved in that, they're still associated with it. And there's no doubt at all that gangs play a huge part in the drug trade in New Zealand, working in with these other organised crime groups overseas, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, it seems to me that we're not ever going to get rid of gangs altogether, right? So let's put that idea aside. Let's think about how we stop. So to me, it seems like it's the meth, it's the easy-ish, I suppose, high risk, high reward money. How do we stop? And I know you probably get this question all the time, but how do we stop them from A, bringing in meth, or B, do we just give them, I don't know, like other opportunities, government contracts to do the security at, I don't know, events or something, another revenue stream, so they stop all the bad stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult, big question to ask, and one that I don't have all the answers to. But what I would say is that, and I don't think there's any one single answer. There's no silver bullet to this, because the gang world, gang life, is intrinsically tied into other bigger, wider social issues that we have in this country, whether that's poverty, unemployment, poor housing, lack of education, lack of opportunity. It's all tied into much bigger issues that can all be tackled in the same kinds of ways. And I mean, one thing that I would say about, those who are attracted into the gang world, I mean, a lot of it is intergenerational and out of communities that gang life is normalized and even idolized in particular, and potentially. So we need to be, it's at a young age, it's providing opportunities for kids in particular. I think sport is and again, sports teams and things that are happening for youth in smaller communities where there might not be opportunities. Those are the sorts of things that can provide kids with a sense of belonging, identity, and even just as simple as providing hope, I suppose, something to look forward to on the weekend, rather than getting sucked into a world where a lot more misery can come from it. And so those are parts of the answers, I'd say. And in terms of the drug aspect of gang life and the money that can be made from it, yes, we need as much enforcement as we possibly can get. The police and customs do the best job that they possibly can, but we certainly need to be looking more into investment, into rehabilitation and counselling opportunities for people who are tied up in addiction, because the only way that the supply of drugs is going to dry out is if the demand for drugs dries up. And so I think a lot more investment could be made in sort of the health aspect of the drug world. I mean, if you're living in a small rural community in the Eastern Bay of Plenty, for example, it's very hard to get the help that you need compared to a much larger sort of city centre like Auckland. So a lot more, and the government is thinking and looking into these kinds of areas, but I would say that the answers lie within communities. In each community I visit or report on in these big drug busts, there's always people in there that are doing amazing work with young people. They just need some support, basically. Yeah, I think the answers lie in individual communities. They're the ones that know what would work for their whānau and their families, and it's a matter of empowering and supporting them.
Yeah, those real grassroots efforts. Hey, I mean, that made me think of a story that in your book, and you've also written about it for the Herald, about Camille. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so Camille Kite was someone who I wrote about in my last book, almost a throwaway kind of line. She was a sort of a drug dealer for the mongrel mob in the Waikato, and so she wasn't a focus of the book. She was just a line in there, a couple of lines in there, and then after the book came out, she rang me and said, just FYI, I've kind of turned my life around and doing really well, and so we agreed to meet up in her new home and just talk about what she's doing now. And she's someone who's gone from being quite heavily involved in that world to now working as a peer support worker. So that's someone who walks alongside those who are in recovery from addiction, and just helping them with basic day-to-day life, really, as a support worker. And so we wrote that piece for the Herald, and we included part of it in the new book now. And she's a really inspiring story, and someone that a lot of these stories are quite dark and quite depressing, and she was a real sort of story of hope and something that sort of was quite uplifting. So there are success stories out there, and those are the kinds of people that we need to be listening to about potential solutions and the way forward.
I got to that point where I was willing and ready to do whatever it took. I never in my entire life ever dreamed that I'd be where I am today. I am a peer support worker for the South Waikato Care New Zealand. So I have a PhD in addiction, right, already. I don't need to go and do the theory and go and do all the books. I've lived it. right? I've got all that knowledge. I know the manipulation. I know what goes on up here, I know the means and ways that we have to live to survive, and it's very valuable.
And what do you believe needs to change in our approach to gangs, if anything? I mean, I'm thinking media-wise, right? Does the media tend to glamorize gang life, or does it completely villainize them? I mean, are there any changes to be made about how we view them?
In terms of reporting on gangs, I mean, I don't think media glamorize gang life. I mean, most of the reporting done is in relation to, gang members being busted for, being involved in the drug world or some kind of violence. So I don't think it's glamorizing gang life. Do gangs get demonized a little bit? Yeah, so sometimes it can feel some of the gang coverage can feel overwhelming at times. It can be sort of everywhere. I think probably the biggest thing to sort of remember in all this is that it's not just gangs involved in the drug world. It's sort of this. I try and talk about organised crime as opposed to gangs, and we talked about that ecosystem before about how some gangs are heavily involved in the drug trade at importing at a never seen before rate. But they're working in with other groups,
And the fact that they're recognizable, we can see them. People love stuff that we fear the unknown, but we love to identify and see things and be like,
that's right.
Gang member.
Yeah, and so they become a face for that, and obviously the coalition government brought in sort of the gang patch ban, and I was kind of a little bit sceptical about it at the time as to what impact it might have, but gangs have been largely compliant with that. I think there was a lot of fears around it sort of being too hard to police, and I mean at this stage, most people seem to be being on board with it, simply because of the fear of inviting trouble into their home, I suppose. I mean, if there's one thing that people don't want, it's the police coming in through their house, looking at, raiding the place. So gangs have been largely compliant with that. And anecdotally, talking to the police, they feel like the patch ban has led to fewer incidents of conflict between random gang members, just walking down the street or whatever, and then causing trouble. So I think we won't see the full benefits or we won't see the full consequences or outcome of that decision for some time yet. But certainly it's, I think, being not so visible and reducing the perceived fear of gangs is a good thing. So that's something I'm hearing anecdotally from gang members too, that they no longer sort of see the point in riding around without their colours on. So, a big part of a gang is now less attractive from some aspects too. So, I guess in time we'll see if that has an impact on recruitment numbers. It's too early to say.
Thanks for joining us, Jared.
No problem. Thanks so much, Chelsea.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Ethan Sills and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I am Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in on Monday for another look behind the headlines.